It's been a little while since I've done a video. Been a crazy busy year, but I think this is going to be one of the better videos. And it's something that this principle is like really, I think a lot of stuff with business, people talk a lot about tactical things, skills that you need to learn, people you need to network with, strategy, all of that stuff. And that stuff is obviously really important. But one of the biggest things in business is actually managing your own mind and identifying your own individual bottlenecks that are preventing certain decisions from being made or certain actions from being taken. And I'll give a very specific example. So I've got a friend I went to school with, and we hadn't seen each other in ages, and caught up with him for lunch, I don't know, about a month ago. And he's just started his business. His is more of like a service-based business. He's a physiotherapist, and he was sort of asking for some advice about what his next move should be. And it's very funny because he's a smart guy, right? So he had already identified what the bottleneck was, which was he was basically capped out with the number of clients he could service himself. And very obviously the next step for him to continue to scale his business was to bring on a contractor. And he knew that it was very obvious that was the next bottleneck. And we were sort of talking about it because we sort of both ascertained that he knew that was the most obvious next step. So then the next question is, why hadn't he taken that step? And the good thing is when you ask, you can do this process with other people, and then that allows you to do that same process with yourself, right? Because everyone is going to have internal blockers or things like that. And one of the most crucial skills you can develop is like really trying to ask the right questions and enough questions to get from the surface level like bullshit, and often it's like a tactical answer you'll tell yourself as to why you have held off on a particular decision or a particular path, even if you think it's the right one. And a lot of the time it's trying to get past that like surface level answer. Let me just close the door, it's a bit loud. That surface level answer to actually figure out what's the true like underlying, typically mental blocker of why you haven't made a decision. So again, using this example, he was talking about, he hadn't hired someone, and I said, well, why haven't you hired them? And he's like, yeah, like I'm just not sure that there are going to be enough leads for them. And I said, well, what's your current lead source? And he's like, well, I use like organic and Facebook ads. And then I said, and what's your cost to acquire a lead, and what's the lifetime value? And he goes, it's X amount per lead, lifetime value is this. And then I said, those numbers are amazing. Is it like a cash flow thing? Are you out for 3 or 4 months before you can recoup that cash? And he goes, no, like, I've got a credit card, whatever. And I get, okay. So the numbers, and you have a pretty consistent lead source, which is Facebook. So why wouldn't you just spend more on ads, and then that person would have enough leads and enough people to do it with? And then he's like, well, then I'm not really sure. What if I hire this person and, they think the business is a bit of a basket case, and like, what if they end up sort of like disappointed? And I said, okay, like, why don't you just manage their expectations? You tell them it's a startup, it's a new business, it's not going to be really well organized, it's going to be chaotic. And then he sort of said like, well, like what if I hire him and, he understands it's chaotic, but the level of service is really poor, and that reflects poorly on me. And throughout that whole process, I could see the common theme between all of these like surface level answers, and the common underlying root cause was he really just didn't want to let down other people. That was really the underlying root cause, and that was kind of the emotional blocker that he was dealing with. So it was like, well, if I hire this person, they come into the business and they think it's a basket case, then he's afraid of what that person thinks. It's like, oh, what if they come into the business and then I don't have enough leads for them, and then I end up having to fire them? Again, afraid of what happens to that person. Or what if they come into the business and I do have enough leads and they understand the business is a basket case, but then they don't represent me well, and then he's afraid of what his clients will then think about the business. So you can then clearly see with people's surface level answer what the actual underlying root cause is of why they're not making a particular decision. And you can use that questioning framework to really identify things that you've been holding off in your own company. And the thing is, they're always going to be individual to you, but they'll typically have like a pretty common root cause. So for me personally, a lot of the things that I put off in my business is fear of making the wrong decision, right? And that probably comes down to some like deep-rooted childhood perfectionism syndrome, right? And once you kind of understand that that's how your wiring is, the whole point, and my belief is you're always going to be wired in certain ways, but you can then create separation from those thoughts, and you can identify that those thoughts aren't helpful, or they aren't productive, or they aren't actually you. They're kind of just how you've been hardwired, and you can then easily move through to the next stage. And really that's kind of the whole game of identifying these bottlenecks over and over and over again, which will often come down to, a typical emotional or mental root cause. And as I said, for me personally, a lot of the time it's that fear of being wrong. And it even then helps, and this is kind of very woo-woo or whatever, but once you identify those bottlenecks in yourself, it's very good. And this is what I did with my friend, is we actually stepped out, what is the worst case scenario if all of those things happen? So in the case of my friend, I said, okay, so let's say someone comes into the business, there's not enough leads for them, and then you end up needing to fire them. What does that look like? And we stepped it out. And then we realized like, okay, that person is probably just going to go and get another job, and then he'll have a lesson that he can then apply to the next employee. And then I said, well, okay, what if they come into the business and they think this place is an absolute fucking basket case, even though you managed their expectations and you told them it would be a basket case? What happens then? So what? And then he stepped that out, and he's like, okay, it's sort of quite irrational. And it's like, once you step out the worst case scenario of a lot of these things happening, and you sort of put it in front of you on a bit of paper, and you realize the consequences aren't that bad, it then actually kind of reduces the weight of that unhelpful thought. And again, it's another easy way for you to then step into that particular bottleneck. And the people that I see progress in business the fastest is they're able to unlock those mental internal bottlenecks as quickly as possible. And that really is the whole game, because even everything is built on that. Like, even if you're lacking certain skills, the ability to then identify the skill that you're lacking and then put full force and commitment into learning that skill, you need to identify and unlock the internal bottlenecks that are preventing you from doing that. Same if it's a particular contact you need to reach out to. Same if it's a particular initiative you need to do. All those things, at the root cause of them, are the internal bottlenecks you need to unlock. So it's really the best skill you can learn within yourself, because all the other things that you need to do, the tactical things, the strategic, the networking, they come off that base. So hopefully that helps everyone. And if you have any comments, questions, or whatever, obviously place them down below.